it was a disaster. I think that it was a disaster for two simple reasons. One is that the Ukrainians gained no military advantage in Kursk itself. There was just no real good reason to go in there. And in fact, once they went in, the Russians brought air power and artillery to bear, and they've decimated the Ukrainian forces. And the Ukrainians have very little to show for this operation. At the same time, the really important battlefield is in eastern Ukraine. That's where the rubber meets the road. And what the Ukrainians had to do to make the Kursk offensive work was they had to pull forces from eastern Ukraine, from the main battlefield. And that just gave the Russians, who already had an advantage in the east, an even greater advantage. So the Ukrainians lose in Kursk and they lose on the Eastern Front. And the end result is they are worse off today than they would be if they had taken those forces they sent into Kursk and either left them on the Eastern Front or moved the new forces to the Eastern Front. But they didn't do that, and they have sped up their defeat. Well, I think that they're both delusional. I think that if you're going to make the case that the Kursk offensive has had a meaningful effect on the course of the war, you have to spell out what that effect is. And they, of course, don't do that. And if you listen to the head of MI6, what he said, is that it effectively has given the Ukrainians a morale boost, which is, of course, temporary and not very meaningful. And it's changed the discourse. Okay, it's changed the discourse, but I'm not really interested in the discourse. What I want to know is what's happening on the battlefield. And those guys have no story to tell about how this improves Ukraine's overall position in the fight against the Russians. This war was not caused by Russian aggression. It was caused by NATO expansion. The Russians, and Putin in particular, made it unequivocally clear that NATO incorporating Ukraine into the alliance was an existential threat, and they would do everything possible to prevent it. And furthermore, with regard to the argument that Putin is not going to win the war or is not winning the war, this is wrong too. One can debate what that victory will look like. I've long argued that in the end, it will be an ugly victory. The Russians will not win a decisive victory, but they're clearly going to end up cleaving off a large chunk of Ukrainian territory, incorporated into Russia. And furthermore, they're going to leave Ukraine as a rump state, a dysfunctional rump state. And if this isn't losing on Ukraine's part and winning on Russia's part, I don't know what is. If you can hit Moscow with one drone, that doesn't buy you very much at all. And by the way, earlier in the war, Ukraine hit Moscow with drones. So this is not the first time this has happened. But these are pinpricks at best. They just don't matter. It's again like the sort of propaganda war that's taken place. When you listen to these intelligence chiefs talk, it's just really, in the end, a lot of blather. The question is what's happening on the battlefield. And when you hear about drone attacks on Moscow, you have to ask yourself one simple question. How does this affect the outcome of the war? And the answer is very simple. It doesn't affect it at all. And by the way, this is the whole issue that's now coming up with regard to whether or not Britain and the United States are going to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike deep into Russia. Whether you think this is going to affect the outcome of the war in any meaningful way. Simply not. And again, the people who are pushing to do this never make the argument that it will do X, Y, and Z. That will shift the balance of power here. And Ukrainians will be back in the driver's seat. You never get arguments like that. You just get these empty claims that when you look at closely fall apart. You and I can both agree that he long ago lost touch with reality.
Yes.
This is just another manifestation of that. I mean, when you hear him talk about how the war is going and what we're going to promise to do for the Ukrainians in the future, all I can say is that the guy is delusional. This is just craziness, right? Ukraine is in deep, deep trouble on the battlefield. And if anything, support for continuing to give Ukraine money and weapons over the long term is beginning to soften greatly, especially in countries like Germany and even in countries like the United States. So, if anything, he should be telling the Ukrainians to work out a deal. Uh, and finally, the point about bringing Ukraine into the EU and especially bringing Ukraine into NATO, this is just dooming Ukraine to even greater damage on the part of the Russians, because the Russians want to make sure that Ukraine never becomes part of NATO. And that gives them a powerful incentive when they hear Blinken talking like that to take more Russian territory and to go to greater lengths to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state. So this is not in Ukraine's interest. It's just making a bad situation, or I should say, it's making a terrible situation even worse. My first question when I hear this is, what impact are those missiles likely to have? In other words, how many missiles are we going to give them? What kind of damage are they going to do? I don't believe we have a lot of missiles to give them. I also believe the Russians have the capability to shoot down a good number of them. How many or what percentage is hard to say at this point in time. But I think if we in the West give Ukraine permission to strike deep into Ukraine with these missiles, a lot will depend on how effective they are. If they're not effective, the Russians won't feel compelled to respond. But if they are effective, and again, I want to be clear here, I don't think they're going to be effective in turning the tide on the battlefield. But if they're effective in terms of killing large numbers of Russian civilians and hitting important targets, like something like the Kremlin, for example, then the Russians will retaliate in a serious way. It all depends who you ask. If you ask the Chinese, they would tell you they basically own most of the South China Sea. From their perspective, it's a giant Chinese lake. From the perspective of the United States and almost all of the countries in East Asia, besides China, it's international waters. And not only do you have a dispute on that very issue, you have all sorts of disputes between countries like the Philippines and China, Vietnam and China, Indonesia and China on who controls certain areas of the South China Sea and who controls certain piles of rocks in the South China Sea. So this is a very dangerous area when you think about a potential conflict between the United States and China. I've long argued that I think that the South China Sea is more dangerous than Taiwan. A lot of people in the West like to focus on Taiwan as the principal flashpoint that we have to worry about. I think there's no question we want to worry about Taiwan, and we want to go to enormous lengths to make sure we don't have a war over Taiwan. But I think a war involving the South China Sea is more likely. That's not to say it is likely. And we have to go to great lengths there to make sure that we don't have a shooting match between the United States and the Philippines on one side and the Chinese on the other. Well, we've been in the South China Sea for a long time. It goes back to World War II, and then we were there during the Cold War. And then when the Cold War ended, we stayed in East Asia just like we stayed in Europe. And as you know, if anything, we increased the size of our footprint around the world after the Cold War ended. So we were not going to leave the South China Sea or East Asia more generally. And then with the rise of China, the United States became focused on containing China. And as we've talked about before on the show, there's this whole question of whether the United States should defend Taiwan. And there's also the question of whether or not the United States should defend the South China Sea for the purposes of containing China. And it seems to me that it's quite clear that whether you're talking about the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or in the future, another Trump administration or Harris administration, we are not going to go home, and we're going to remain in the South China Sea. We're going to remain committed to making sure that it is an international body of water and we're going to remain committed to the Philippines. And all of this just tells you that this is a dangerous situation. You want to remember is that China is effectively a giant aircraft carrier. So if a war were to break out over Taiwan or over the South China Sea or over the East China Sea, the United States and the Chinese were to start shooting at each other, it wouldn't simply be the navies, the ships that were in the water that mattered. In fact, one could argue that all of the land-based aircraft and all of the land-based missiles inside of China would be of tremendous advantage to the Chinese in a conflict against us. The first mistake he made was long ago when he rejected a two-state solution and he decided that he was going to create a greater Israel that would effectively be an apartheid state. That was a huge blunder. Then he made a huge blunder in not foreseeing what happened on October 7th. The buck stops with him. He was the prime minister of Israel, and he is ultimately responsible for the disaster that befell Israel on October 7th. Then, once the war began, once Israel turned the dogs loose in Gaza, he made another huge mistake because what he ended up doing was not only trying to defeat Hamas decisively, which was impossible to do, but he ended up trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza, which took him down the road to genocide. And in the end, the Israelis have murdered huge numbers of Palestinian civilians, and they have not defeated Hamas. What he should have done if he was smart, and I'm talking about what he should have done from his own perspective, is he should have just said, we made a fundamental mistake on October 7th. We were unprepared. We got caught with our pants down. And what we're going to do is we're going to build the defenses around Gaza to the point where Hamas can never do that again. And we are going to go from there. And we're not going to go to war inside of Gaza. We're not going to try to reconquer Gaza or decisively defeat Hamas because that's not possible. But he didn't do that. He didn't, come back basically to a situation where Israel maintained Gaza as a giant open air prison, which is what he should have done. Again, I want to be clear. My argument is that long ago, he should have moved towards a two-state solution, given the Palestinians a state of their own. But absent that, it was a foolish move to go to war inside of Gaza. And he's stuck there now. Let me give you a little background on this case. Bill Clinton was in his last year in the White House. This is 2000. And he was deeply committed to creating some sort of peaceful agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which in his mind meant a two-state solution. So I think there's no question that Clinton's heart was in the right place. And he pushed both Barack and Arafat to meet at Camp David in the summer of 2000. Now, Arafat said, I don't want to meet. Arafat said, we have not done enough preliminary legwork to produce a meaningful agreement. Clinton put enormous pressure on Arafat to come. Arafat said, I'll go to Camp David, but I want to be clear that I don't think this is going to work out. And if it doesn't work out, I don't want you to blame me. In other words, I don't want you to stab me in the back. So they went to Camp David, they negotiated. The negotiations failed, right? They did not reach an agreement. The idea that there was an agreement that Clinton had crafted, a final agreement, it was presented to Ehud Barak, and he accepted it, and Arafat rejected it, is simply not true. And in fact, after Camp David failed, the two sides continued to negotiate because there was a possibility of a deal. There's no question about that. But there was no deal reached at Camp David. Camp David broke up. And of course, Bill Clinton stabbed Arafat in the back. He blamed Arafat for the failure. And the story that Hillary is now telling is the story that Bill told after Camp David failed. And Arafat, who foolishly went to Camp David believing that Clinton would be true to his word, ended up being the bad guy. And if you talk to most supporters of Israel in the United States today, they'll tell you that story every time. It's a story that's constantly repeated. And Hillary now repeating it will just give more ammunition to Israel's supporters to make the argument that we'd all be living happily ever after had it not been for Arafat, which is another way of saying if it hadn't been for those evil Palestinians. I don't know what he's thinking here. I really don't. I mean, if the Israelis go after Lebanon, they can do it in one of two ways. One is they can invade with ground forces, and two, they can bomb Hezbollah from the air. When you listen to Netanyahu talk and you listen to many Israelis talk, it sounds like they're going to go in there with ground forces. I find it hard to believe that they would countenance doing that. First of all, their army is in terrible shape, in large part because of all the wear and tear from what's been going on in Gaza since last October. They're having a huge problem with reservists, and reservists comprise more than half of the IDF forces. Furthermore, if you go into southern Lebanon and you tangle with Hezbollah, you're going into a hornet's nest. It's not like this is going to be an easy victory. This is not going to be like the Six-Day War in 1967. You want to remember the Israelis went into southern Lebanon to tangle with Hezbollah in 2006, and they basically lost. They came out with their tail between their legs. So with an army that's in bad shape, and a Hezbollah fighting force that's more effective today than it was in 2006. I want to know how the Israelis are going to go in there and solve the problem. The United States is in the area, and one might argue the United States can help the Israelis, but are we going to send in ground forces? I find that hard to imagine. I guess we could help the Israelis bomb Hezbollah, but I'm not sure the Israelis need that much help bombing Hezbollah. And if the Israelis and the Americans begin to bomb Hezbollah, I think Hezbollah is going to launch a huge chunk of those 150,000 plus rockets and missiles that it has at Israel. I'm not sure this is good for Israel. I'm not sure that this is the way Israel should proceed. What the Israelis should do is they should agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, because once they agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, that will end the war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is in this war or in this shooting match with Israel because of what's going on in Gaza. So let's get a ceasefire in Gaza, and then you don't have the Hezbollah problem anymore. And all of those, I would guess 60, 70,000 Israelis who live in the north of Israel normally, but are now displaced, can go back home. But of course, Netanyahu won't agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. And the end result is the shooting match between Hezbollah on one side and Israel on the other shows no signs of ending. Netanyahu basically thinks that he owns us. He gets whatever he wants. You saw what happened when he went before Congress.
Oh, yes.
He doesn't worry about American support. This is not a serious issue. If Iran attacks, we're all waiting for the big Iranian attack. If Iran attacks Israel, the United States, and this is why we have all those military assets in the theater, is going to help the Israelis fend off the Iranian attack. We help the Israelis at every turn. And the Biden administration is certainly not going to hesitate to help Israel. We have the Monroe Doctrine here in the Western Hemisphere. We are a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And we have told distant great powers like the Chinese and the Russians that they cannot form a military alliance with any countries in the Western Hemisphere, and they cannot deploy military forces permanently in the Western Hemisphere. You remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and after that, the Soviets talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba, and we told them in no uncertain terms that was not possible. But that didn't mean that the Caribbean was not an international body of water. It was. But we just told the distant great powers, in this case the Soviet Union, at the time, that it couldn't permanently station forces in the area. And the same thing is true with regard to China. There's no question that China can bring naval forces right off the coast of California. It can bring naval forces right off the coast of Long Island. It can bring naval forces into the Caribbean, but they can't stay there, and they can't form a military alliance with a country in the region. And what the United States does not want is for China to be in a position where it dominates East Asia, and that includes the South China Sea. And the United States is there to prevent China from dominating East Asia. We don't want, and I know you disagree with this, we don't want China to dominate East Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And that's really what's going on here. The debate about whether it's international waters or whether it's a Chinese lake, I think that's really of secondary importance. The key point is we don't want China to be so powerful that it dominates the region and can maybe even push us out beyond the first island chain and then the second island chain. You know, we have a Monroe Doctrine, but if you were in charge in Beijing, wouldn't you want to have a Monroe Doctrine of your own? Wouldn't you want to get American military forces out of your face? Basically, what Putin said is, I do not want NATO forces on my doorstep.
Right.
I don't want them in my face in Ukraine. And the Chinese feel the same way about American forces in the South China Sea. I don't blame them one bit. If we have a Monroe Doctrine, you would expect them to have a Monroe Doctrine. She says that they were also deeply disturbed when they looked, when they, meaning the United States, looked at the various appendices or appendixes to the agreement was being negotiated, that there were significant limits on Ukraine's ability to defend itself in terms of the number of weapons and the kinds of weapons that the Ukrainians themselves could have. And of course, NATO weapons or US weapons were verboten. So what we discovered was that Ukraine would be left in a position where it couldn't defend itself in any meaningful way. And that's, of course, what the Russians wanted. But I would just make one further point about this. I think by early April, Victoria Nuland, Joe Biden, that whole crowd had come to the conclusion that we could defeat the Russians. The Russian military did not perform well in March and early April. And we thought we could defeat them on the battlefield. And we thought that sanctions would bring Russia to its knees. So I think the deep reason that we walked away, or we pushed the Ukrainians to walk away from the Istanbul negotiations, was not simply because of what was in these appendices, but it was because we thought that we could decisively defeat the Russians in this war. A catastrophic miscalculation, only matched by the initial decision in April 2008 to bring Ukraine into NATO. That was a decision that's going to reverberate for long. It was just a huge mistake. And of course, when the crisis breaks out in February 2014, instead of rethinking this situation and asking where we are and maybe backing off to avoid further trouble, what we do is double down. And if you look at what's happened at every point after February 2014, and you listen to Tony Blinken speak as he did about 10 minutes ago here on the show, what you see is that we continue to double down. And the end result of this is the situation gets worse and worse for Ukraine and worse for us.